You thought they'd come. When the doctors said the word critical, you expected footsteps in the hallway, messages from friends, a trembling voice on the phone saying, "I'm here for you." But silence has a sound of its own, a sound that crawls into your mind when you realize no one is coming. At first, you waited, because that's what you were taught to do. You grew up believing that if you were good, kind, and helpful, the world would repay you in your darkest hour. That if you collapsed, someone would pick you up. But the truth hits harder than illness itself. When you're on the edge of life, you see who truly stands beside you. And often, it's no one. That's when the first crack appears. Not in your body, but in your illusions. You start to understand what Jung meant when he said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Because pain, real pain, is not something the world wants to share. It makes people uncomfortable. It reminds them of their own fragility. So they turn away. They tell themselves you'll recover. They post something kind online, maybe whisper a short prayer, and then go on with their lives. Meanwhile, you stare at the ceiling, learning the cold truth. That no one truly cares about your struggle, not the way you imagined. And yet, there's something strange about that realization, something freeing, because once you stop expecting others to carry your burden, you begin to stand differently. You begin to see your suffering not as injustice, but as initiation. The loneliness becomes a mirror, reflecting who you are without the noise, without the masks. You start to notice how much of your past life was built on silent contracts. I'll care for you if you care for me. But the world doesn't sign those deals. It owes you nothing. And the moment you realize that, your pain begins to shift. You didn't die from the illness alone. You almost died from your illusions. And when those illusions were gone, something else was born in their place. Something far more powerful. Because the death of expectation is the birth of freedom. And in that silence, the same silence that once terrified you, you begin to breathe again, not for others, but for yourself. You finally understand. No one is coming to save you, but maybe. That's the point. In that realization, a new life begins. A life where pain no longer defines you, it refines you. A life where you no longer wait for the world to care, because you've learned to care enough for yourself to keep going anyway. After that realization, something subtle happens. You begin to notice how much of the world runs on performance, especially when it comes to pain. People wear their suffering like a badge, not because they want healing, but because they crave attention. The more they share their misery, the more sympathy they receive. And sympathy feels like validation. It's a quiet addiction. In a culture obsessed with being seen, even pain becomes a product. You post about your heartbreak, your struggles, your anxiety, and the world rewards you with likes, comments, fleeting comfort. But none of it makes you whole. Jung warned that the more we identify with our wounds, the more we become them. Pain starts to define you, and soon you're afraid to let it go. Because without it, who are you? That's the trap. We turn suffering into identity, and identity into pride. We think our pain makes us special, when in reality, it only makes us dependent. Dependent on validation, on empathy, on others recognizing our wounds. And the moment people stop paying attention, we feel abandoned all over again. It's not that people are cruel. It's that they're busy with their own masks. Everyone is performing something, strength, success, stability, but underneath, they're all fighting their own invisible wars. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted by the tribe. It hides not just our darkness, but our despair. And the longer we wear it, the more disconnected we become from what's real. Think about it. How many times have you said, "I'm fine," when you weren't? How often have you smiled just to seem okay? We do it because being vulnerable feels dangerous, because deep down, we know the world doesn't actually want the truth. It wants the version of us that makes sense. So we hide our pain behind humor, behind busyness, behind ambition. Some people even romanticize their suffering, turning it into an aesthetic. They say they're broken but beautiful, hurt but healing. It sounds poetic, but it's just another way of staying comfortable inside the wound. Because true healing requires something terrifying: silence, solitude, self-confrontation. And most people would rather distract themselves than face that. Jung believed that until you stop showing your wounds for sympathy, you'll never truly grow from them. Because every time you seek validation for your pain, you give away your power. You let others decide what your suffering means. The man who once waited for others to care now sees through it all. He watches people talk about pain like it's a trend, and he understands they don't really want healing. They want recognition. They want the world to say, "We see you." But what happens when the world stops looking? That's when the real transformation begins. Because the moment you stop performing your suffering, you start to understand it. You stop feeding it with attention, and it begins to shrink. What's left behind is not weakness. It's clarity. Suffering loses its charm when you no longer need it to prove anything. It simply becomes what it always was: a teacher. And when you learn to listen instead of display, pain starts guiding you towards something far more powerful than pity. It leads you inward, toward a strength that no audience can applaud and no silence can take away. The performance ends, and the real you, the one hidden beneath all that noise, finally begins to breathe. There comes a moment when life stops asking politely. It stops whispering lessons and starts tearing things apart. The job you thought was secure disappears. The person you trusted vanishes. The plans you built fall apart overnight. And suddenly, the same world that once seemed predictable becomes unrecognizable. That's the collapse. The point where everything that held you together begins to break. Most people panic here. They run to distractions, to noise, to anything that will drown out the silence of what's been lost. But Jung believed that this collapse is not destruction, it's revelation. It's the moment when your false self dies. The part of you that depended on others, on recognition, on control. All of it burns away, and in that fire, the shadow begins to appear. The shadow is everything you've refused to see in yourself. The anger, the envy, the fear, the need to be loved. When life strips away your illusions, you're forced to face it. That's why breakdowns often feel unbearable, because for the first time, there's no one left to blame, no role left to hide behind. Just you and your truth. You realize that most of what you called your life was built on borrowed expectations. What your parents wanted, what society approved, what looked respectable. But deep down, it never belonged to you. So when it collapses, it's not tragedy, it's honesty. The illusion of control dies, and you begin to see reality as it is. Raw, unpredictable, alive. That's where real strength is born. Not in the moments when everything is perfect, but when everything is gone and you still choose to rebuild. Not because you believe the world will reward you, but because you've accepted that the reward is in the act itself, in becoming who you were meant to be. Jung once said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But once you do, you realize how much of your suffering came from resistance, from clinging to people who were never yours, to dreams that were never meant for you, to comfort that was quietly killing you. The collapse strips that all away. It hurts, but it's pure, because what remains afterward is real. You start living not from fear, but from clarity. You stop chasing approval and start building meaning. You stop performing and start existing. And if you've made it this far, if these words resonate somewhere deep, take a second to subscribe. It costs nothing to you, but it means everything to us. And to the growing circle of people who still believe in truth, reflection, and the kind of honesty the world avoids. Because this isn't just another video. It's a conversation. One that reminds you that collapse isn't the end. It's the door to who you really are. The illusion had to die, so that you, the real you, could finally begin to live. After the collapse, something strange happens. You wake up one morning and realize the fear is gone, not because the world has become kinder, but because you no longer expect it to be. You stop waiting for people to understand you, to recognize your effort, to care about your pain. You stop asking life to be fair, and instead, you start to build, quietly, patiently, from the ruins. This is where real strength begins. Not in applause, not in validation, but in the silence after loss. It's the point where you no longer need the world to see you in order to keep going. You've already faced the worst, being forgotten. And somehow, you're still standing. That realization changes the way you move. You stop reacting and start observing. You stop defending yourself and start understanding yourself. Because once you've survived being unseen, you stop fearing obscurity. Once you've lived through being abandoned, you stop begging to belong. Strength doesn't look like confidence anymore. It looks like calm. It's no longer loud. It's steady. You no longer need to prove yourself because pain already tested you and you're still here. You start noticing how people chase distractions to avoid themselves. They hide behind noise, behind goals, behind other people's approval. But you've already seen what lies behind all that. Emptiness. You've walked through it, and you know it can't destroy you. That realization makes you dangerous in the best way possible. Not because you seek power, but because you're no longer ruled by fear. You begin to understand that strength isn't about domination or control. It's about endurance. It's about knowing that the world owes you nothing, and still choosing to give your best anyway. You work not for recognition, but for peace. You give not to be remembered, but because generosity has become your nature. You help without needing to be seen helping. From this point, life feels lighter, not because it's easier, but because you've stopped fighting what you can't control. You no longer carry resentment toward those who left. You understand they couldn't stay. You no longer feel bitterness toward those who didn't care. You realize they were never supposed to. The world hasn't changed. You have. You stop fighting to be understood. You stop explaining your worth. You stop trying to fix people who never asked for help. Instead, you turn inward, rebuild in silence, and live with a kind of dignity that noise can't touch. And when people see you again, they'll sense it. The calm, the unshakable presence. They won't understand how you became this way because they never saw the fire you walked through. But you'll know. Strength isn't born from power. It's born from surrender, from letting go of everything you thought you needed, until only what's real remains. That's when you realize the point was never to be saved. It was to save yourself. And that strength, quiet, earned, invisible to most, becomes your greatest freedom. You remember the hospital bed, the machines, the sterile smell, the sense of life hanging by a thread. Back then, you expected someone to come, a friend, a relative, someone to say, "I'm here." But no one came. And in that silence, something inside you broke, and something else quietly began to grow. That moment, lying alone, taught you the harshest truth. No one is coming to save you. The world does not pause for your pain. The people you love will not always show up, and the life you imagined will not bend to your will. At first it was terrifying, but over time it became liberating. You stopped expecting sympathy. You stopped waiting for validation. You stopped needing someone else to define your worth. In that emptiness, you discovered freedom, the freedom of detachment. You began to see life differently. Disappointments no longer shatter you. Failures no longer define you. The chaos of the world, indifferent, relentless, unforgiving, no longer holds power over your peace. Surviving that critical illness, alone and unseen, taught you that survival itself was the proof of your strength. Freedom is not about isolation. It's detachment from need. The need for people to care, for circumstances to align, for the world to play fair. You act now from purpose, not expectation. You give effort, love, and attention, not to be acknowledged, but because it's who you are. You notice how many live performing for applause, masking fear with pride, turning their struggles into spectacle. You once did that too, but now you've moved beyond it. You no longer seek the world's permission to exist. You simply live. Life feels lighter. You no longer carry resentment toward those who left, or bitterness toward those who ignored you. You simply move forward, quietly, steadily, with a presence shaped by what you survived. The world hasn't changed. You have. You are free. Not because anyone rescued you, but because you finally stopped needing them to. The illness, the abandonment, the silence, they were never enemies. They were teachers. And in their harsh lessons, you discovered the most profound truth of all. True strength and true freedom come from standing alone and still choosing to live fully.